Welcome to the Wheel With It podcast with your host, Devin. At Wheel With It, we are dedicated to exploring DEI issues in a fair, balanced, and fun way. Let's get into the episode.
Hello. Welcome to another episode of Wheel With It. Today, we have a very timely episode, I believe. We have Phyllis Leavitt. She is a psychotherapist, and she has a lot of great things to say about the political divisions in this country. She also has a new book out called America in Therapy. I don't want to give too much away here, but enjoy my conversation with Phyllis Leavitt. Hello. Hello. Welcome to another episode of Real With It. And today we have Phyllis Leavitt. I hope I'm pronouncing that.
It's actually Leavitt, but that's fine.
Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate being here.
Tell us about yourself, and then we'll go from there.
Okay, great. I have been a psychotherapist for over 30 years and have had a lot of experience with children and adults and families and couples, and a lot of experience with what sort of constitutes a dysfunctional family or an abusive family and a more healthy family. And obviously, the goal of good psychotherapy is to help people find healthy relationships and heal whatever wounds they've had that might be generating dysfunctional behaviors or upsets in their relationships with partners, with bosses, with children, with friends, with spouses, all of that. And so really out of my years of experience, I came to realize that the dynamics of families, whether they're functional or non-functional, get played out in larger organizations, in any kind of group situation, in places of business, in larger institutions, and in our government. And so I began to see particularly the dynamics of large institutions and places of power as mirroring either healthy family dynamics or unhealthy family dynamics, or even abuse family dynamics. And so I began to write a book about that, and I've called the book America in Therapy, because my goal is that as a country, we would see the need to heal our psychological wounds as a country, as divided groups, as people with different interests, different needs, different backgrounds, different agendas, different sexual orientation, or different problems, that we would see the need to heal our great divides rather than keep on fueling them and fighting for who's going to win. Because one of the things I've learned as a psychotherapist is that we all win when everybody wins, and we all lose when we stay in a battle for who's right and who's wrong, and especially as it escalates into hatred and violence. So that's the theme of my book, and that's the theme of my work.
So that is a mouthful, especially
You're not kidding.
where we are right now. You could probably write about 200 books on that, and it wouldn't cover it all. But where do we even start with that?
I think, what my hope is that, as bad as sometimes it looks, and there are things that are really of concern and threat to us, not only as Americans, but as world citizens. But I write about America because that's the country I live in, and that's the climate that I'm most familiar with. But I think some of the things that are happening here are happening all over the world. And so the frame I want to put around it is this, that in the world of psychotherapy and psychology, we have some understanding of what generates the worst violence and abuse and dysfunction in families. And we have some good ideas about what stops the cycle and what helps people heal, even when they've been terribly hurt. Do we have all the answers? No. Can we heal everyone? No. But the world of psychology has so much to offer in terms of what does heal and what stops the cycle of violence that's not being used on a national level. I call it this, some of the answers are lying hidden in plain sight. Some of the principles of the best family therapy, for instance, could they, if they were applied on a national level, on a large institution level, we could begin to heal some of the great divides instead of fueling them. And so what I want to say is, it's like when you go to a doctor, you want the doctor to tell you the truth. You have A, B, and C. This, and maybe it's serious. Your appendix is about to burst. You want somebody to tell you that so that they know what needs to be done to save your life, right? You don't want them to say, oh, it's a pain, go home and take some aspirin if they think your appendix is bursting. And then you want them to know the very best techniques for how to take your appendix out safely so that you will heal and get better. And it's the same thing with our mental health. What I see is that we are in some danger here, and I would call it a mental health crisis. We've been told that it's an ideological divide, that there's right and wrong, there's good and bad, and that good is fighting evil, all these kinds of things, when really it's what, from my point of view as a psychotherapist, we're not really suffering from ideological differences. We will always have differences of opinion. What we're suffering from is mental health illness, which is that people are not committed to working out relationships in a peaceful, constructive way. That's what we want in our families. We want people to sit down and listen and do their best to hear each other and reach some kind of non-violent compromise. And yet we don't ask that of ourselves as governments and large institutions. And these are some of the principles of the best family therapy and psychology.
So, what does help us heal?
Yeah, first of all, there has to be a motivation. And there's no one answer to your question. There really isn't. There's so many angles to look at this from. But what I can say as a therapist is that what usually motivates people to come to therapy is a certain amount of pain, a certain amount of something really isn't working in their life, and it causes great distress. And my hope for our country is that we can feel enough of the pain that so many people are feeling that would motivate us to look for a different answer than to keep on fighting. Because in a family, we know that keeping on fighting doesn't resolve anyone's issue, bring any happiness, any peace, any fulfillment, or even any safety. And I would love to see those same understandings and principles brought to our country, our large institutions, our local communities, religious organizations, all the issues around women's rights, around minority populations, all of that we could sit down at the table and look for solutions together. But we have to feel some of the pain. And unfortunately, one of the overriding principles, I think, in our country today is that we numb out from pain. We don't want to feel it. We want to look good. We want to deny that there's a problem. And I think a certain amount of pain is important as a motivator. So the two things I would say quickly in answer to your question, and then there's like a million other answers, are that we have to feel enough of our own distress, that there are populations in our country alone that are really targeted for abuse and neglect, and people are suffering. But I will tell you that in all my years as a therapist, I have not worked with the most targeted populations. I lived in a sort of a suburban community and have worked with people more or less like myself. And the amount of suffering and abuse in the average American is epidemically high. The amount of abuse and neglect that people have come from in their families that even look very good on the outside is enormous. And I think we have to address this as a country because the fallout is hurting all of us. So we have to feel our pain, and we have to be motivated to actually be willing to do something new and learn something new.
And there are novels in what you said, but it really is true that as much as we try to, and I don't do politics on this podcast, we never will do politics on this podcast, but as much as we try to deny it, America is the greatest country ever to exist. Okay, don't get me wrong, but it's not as just as we would have liked to think it is, because I've personally experienced the playing field is not level like we think it is.
Right.
But, and again, that's not a political statement, that's a statement of fact, in my opinion. So, how do we start to realize where we are?
Realized that political is not a bad word. What we're really dealing with is partisanship. When partisanship is extreme, when people are really divided and they're entrenched in their side and they're not willing to listen to another point of view, that's the problem. I think extreme partisanship is the problem. Everything really is political today because politics governs so much of how money is allocated, where resources go, how we see defense, how we fund or don't fund education or healthcare. I think we want to destigmatize the word political and really target that partisanship is the problem. We are entitled to have different opinions, but in a healthy family, whether it's a family of America or my family, or your family, or just an individual family, or within a business and organization, a healthy group sits down and tries to work out their problems with respect for one another and listen to more than one point of view, not only because that's a healthy thing to do, but because usually people have something of value to contribute. And if we're open to all voices, we have a better chance of resolving problems. So that's how I look at it. And so we're not talking about red and blue. We're talking about healthy human relationships that we really try to create in the best psychotherapy and family therapy models. Does that make sense?
Yes. So, can you describe that model a little more?
Yeah, there's a lot of components to it, so I probably can't describe them all. But for one thing, let's just say you're dealing with a couple, because that's two people who come to, if they come to therapy, they're having problems, right? People don't come to therapy if they're not having problems, if they're getting along. So if a couple comes to therapy, they're having difficulty managing their relationship. And generally, each person feels like the other person is wrong, and they want the therapist to side with them against their partner and really show their partner how wrong they are so that they can get what they want from them. And while that's human and normal, most of us do think we're right and we want the other person to agree with us. I think that's just human nature. That doesn't actually work for working out a relationship. So while I might really want you to hear me, and I will want you to hear me if I'm one of those partners and validate whatever I think is valid in my upset with you, you want the same thing from me. And so one of the basic components of really good therapy is teaching people deep listening skills, how to listen without just reacting and storming out of the room or threatening or blaming, but to really listen deeply and try to understand where another person is coming from. And let me tell you, it's hard. This is not easy work. It's not, oh, let's just make peace and it's all fine. Peace is some of the hardest work there is in the world to create because we're very invested in our point of view and what we want. So we start with deep listening skills. We start with really trying to build respect for one another. We're trying to build the respect for the other person that we want ourselves. Okay, and I can go on with a long list, but I'm going to let you jump in.
Yeah, your answers are a mouthful today. I very rarely get flustered, but I'm like, okay, where do I go from there? Can you talk a little bit about the rise of extremism in the country? And like I said, we don't do politics, but I think we could all agree it's rising. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I would start with, how I would relate to what you're saying is we don't do politics is we're not invested in blame. And it's really easy to be invested in blame. And that's one of the contributions of the best psychotherapy and family therapy models and psychology is that the goal is not to blame people. The goal is to heal our human relations. And that's where I think psychology has something to offer on the national level that a lot of other studies and a lot of other approaches don't have to offer. It's not about who's right and who's wrong ultimately. It's about healing our human relations and coming back into some kind of safe, peaceful, nonviolent, loving connection with one another, because that's how we learn to cooperate. When people are attacked, they don't want to cooperate. So the rise in extremism, I think there's many ways you could talk about that, and I couldn't possibly cover them all. But I think it's a sign of our mental ill health that we have become so invested in conquering each other. I'm going to overpower you to get what I want, whether it's righteousness that I want, or resources that I want, or some kind of superiority or power and control that I want. I think that has gotten out of control, and people are so invested in keeping their power that they've lost their sense of our shared humanity. There's economic reasons for what you're talking about. There's religious reasons that are fueling it. There's gender reasons that are fueling extremism. There's social media influences that are fueling extremism. It comes from so many angles that I really couldn't address them all. But the bottom line is our mental health, because when we're mentally healthy, we want to work things out.
Okay, so first of all, can you talk about just the stats of mental health in this country right now? Because I think it's mind-blowing.
I don't have the statistics, but I know from my own, and I have read them, but what some different studies have said, but I don't have those studies in front of me, but I know it's enormous. And I know that since one of the things that I had read about was that the political scene itself and the great divides that we're facing have actually fueled a lot of divisiveness in individual families, where people are on different sides and they're arguing with each other and estranged from each other over national issues. And so I think as a country, we can look at the rise in child poverty. We can look at the definite acceleration in mass shootings, in discrimination against minority and marginalized people. And those are all signs of ill mental health, and they are accelerating. So yes, I think it's in our face.
And can you talk a little bit about the role that social media has played in this?
It's so interesting because our technologies are so incredible. We are so smart. We are so creative. The technologies that people have devised are amazing. That I can see you right now, wherever you are. I don't even know where you live, but I can see and talk to you. We couldn't do anything like that when I was a child. It wasn't even conceivable when I was a child. So we have this incredible technological potential, but we actually have to decide how we're going to use it. Are we going to use it to bring people together, to inform people about the truth of what's happening? Are we going to use it to foster great ideas of how we could cooperate to save the environment, to help children, to enhance education, to inform people about what's going on the other side of the world, without mobilizing hatred and discrimination and aggressive control energies? So I think we have to decide. And I think a lot of the media, as I think we all know this, a lot of the media is being used today to fuel the divides, to mobilize people against one another instead of for how we can come together and work together for our mutual survival. And unfortunately, young people with phones, but all people, it's not just young people. The young generation is now being brought up with this technology. Like I wasn't brought up with any of it. And a lot of people weren't. And a lot of young people today just believe everything they hear on social media when a lot of it is not the truth. So we as a human race, we as Americans have to decide how we're going to use the great tools that we have created.
That is, yeah, that's scary because me and my friend were talking about this years ago, but it applies today. Gen Z, the generation after me, millennials grew up with it from about, we'll say, middle school on, and we didn't even have that much social media when I was in middle school. We only had Facebook because MySpace had gone out of business at that time. So we only had Facebook and MySpace if we had it before it went out of business. But by the time middle school hit, we only had Facebook. These kids now are born practically knowing how to use this stuff, and they have 10 or 15 apps at any given time. I'm like, that is kind of awesome. And I use all those 10 or 15 apps and scary at the same time.
I think one of the basic things that, first of all, I think education is the most valuable tool right now to educate people about the positives and the dangers of all those technologies, and the positives and the dangers of that are happening in our human relations. But one of the things that I think we all need to learn at a very young age, that the technological world makes it hard to understand, is that we are actually wired to connect. We are wired to love and make connection with other human beings. And when we don't get enough food on that level, we suffer. And unfortunately, I think what a lot of people don't understand is that they're trying to fill that gap with technology, with material goods, with looking good, with what kind of car they drive or the clothes they wear or how they fit in with other people. And we really need to know that we're wired to actually bond and connect and feel valued and cooperate with others. And that our impulses to compete, which are also normal and human, to be safe, they have to be within the container of cooperation and connection with others.
Can you talk a little bit about the rise of fascism and how that is plays into mental illness?
I think that's part of the extremism that you're talking about. There's a very well-known forensic psychiatrist named Dr. Bandy Lee, who I had heard talk on a radio show. And what she said was exactly in line with what I'm writing about in my book. I don't use these words, but what she said was the essence of a lot of what I have to say. And what she said was, fascism is not an ideology. It's not a political movement. It's a mental illness. And I totally agree with that. Extreme, I don't know what you'd call it, extreme approaches to human relations like fascism, which are based in absolute control and domination and suppression and ultimately often murder of other people who disagree or don't comply, or for whatever reasons they're targeted. That we know that in your community, in my community, if somebody goes out and targets someone and kills them, we call that criminal. We know that stems from mental ill health, that someone would have the desire and the impulse to kill another person and do it. And yet we don't see government that way. We don't see large institutions of power that way. And when there is a desire for that much absolute control of other people without regard to their needs or letting them have a voice, and deliberate targeting of certain populations to keep that power, that's mental illness.
Yeah, there's a very fine line between government and mental illness. So, can we talk about the war in Ukraine and what's going on there as far as from your perspective before we get off?
I believe, while we will say a general statement that war is an outdated paradigm for human relations, and we have to know that. We have to know that war does not solve anything, and it breaks my heart that the people who suffer most in war have nothing to do with it. The people whose, communities are bombed and children are killed have nothing to do with the positions of power that started it. And it really breaks my heart that innocent people all over the world are killed for someone else's power initiatives. So I believe war is an outdated paradigm, and that because we are now armed with the kinds of weapons, nuclear weapons, that could destroy life on this planet, we have to get it. And I hope we do.
Yeah, I don't want to be too fearful on here, but I'm worried that we're going to have a nuclear war here soon.
And bless you for doing your podcast and giving people an opportunity to speak up, because the antidote to the worst of what's happening is to have more and more people speak up for peace, for cooperation, for working things out, for deep understanding, for healing their own wounds and not acting them out on other people. And the more people that can speak up for that, hopefully we can reach a tipping point where that really has broader influence.
Is there anything you would like to add before we get off here?
No, I just really want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope my book, American Therapy, will be coming out soon. Please look for me on my website, www.phyllisleavitt.com. I'm on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and Twitter and all those places. And yeah.
And all those links will be in the show notes. Are they on your website, the links to your social media?
That's a good question. I think they are, but I'll have to check. And I'm in the process of updating my website. So I'll have a new website soon, but I will make sure that all those links are on there. But if you just Google me, I come up everywhere.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yes. If you don't see it in the show notes, just Google her name and it'll come up everywhere. Thank you for being here today. We will see you guys next episode. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed the show. Remember to follow the show and our guests on social media and subscribe to the show on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app using the links in the show notes. If you're listening on the podcast app, please remember to rate and review us. See you